Sometimes I get frustrated when I make some videos because I think people aren't listening to me. Okay, I'm trying to explain why blocks were so much higher in the 1960s, and people keep going with the same thing. Like, I got a subscriber of mine, nice guy, okay, not a troublemaker, doesn't troll the comment section, doesn't call people opinions dumb. I like the guy, but I'm trying to explain to him that his logic and why he's saying that these blocks totals are ridiculous is flawed. I'm trying to explain to him something. He keeps using Kareem, who's pictured here, Hall of Famer, the greatest center of all time, in my opinion. He keeps using him as a benchmark as to how Russell and Chamberlain's blocks, or the guesstimate of how many blocks they've had, which is just a guess. Nobody really knows. But the consensus is they probably had somewhere between 7,000 to 9,000 career blocks. And he thinks that number is ridiculous. And he'll say, well, Kareem would have had to play 40 years to get there, or Kareem would have had to play till he was 75 to get there. That's just ridiculous. And what I'm trying to tell him and other people is that the reason why that's flawed is because you're using, first of all, the game was different. There were more possessions. I don't know how to explain it more basically than that. Okay. The game now, even though this sounds weird, because people are like, well, the scoring is much higher than it was in, 10, 15 years ago. Well, maybe 10 years ago. Maybe 15 years ago. Not 20 years ago. The game is played differently now. Okay? The three-point shot is more dominant than it's ever been in the history of the league. All right. Because so many players take shots from so far out and away from the paint and away from the grass of the NBA center, that is why today the league leading shot blocker, I think it's that fella from Utah. What is his name? Gobert? He averages 2.6 blocks per game. I know for a long stretch this season it was Anthony Davis averaging 2.5 blocks a game. Now, in the 1990s, that would have probably ranked you maybe 4th, 5th in the league. Well, maybe 4th or 5th. Go back and look at the shot block leaders in the 1990s. And generally speaking, they averaged between 3 to as many as 5 blocks per game. 3.5 to about 5 blocks a game, I'll say. Why were they higher then? Because players, well, a little bit because of the quality of the big man, a little bit of that. But a lot of it because the way the game was still being played. The three-point shot was becoming more of a factor by the mid-1990s. Certainly much more than it was in the 1980s. But players were still shooting mid-range. You had still more quality big men or post players who would score more in the post. There was still more of a reliance on the 4 or 5 in the offensive schemes when it came to teams. Therefore, there were more shot blocking opportunities for big men. That's why the shot block leaders were higher. Then you go back to the 1980s. The three-point shot was still in its infancy. Larry Bird was one of the first guys to popularize that shot, him and Dale Ellis and Michael Adams later on. But up until the late 80s, the three-point shot was still seen as a little bit of a novelty. So therefore, in the 80s, you seen even higher block totals. You saw guys like Manute Bol averaging maybe 2.5 blocks or 3 blocks, but he only played like 20 minutes a game. You had the great Mark Eaton, have a career 3.5 blocks per game average. You had him officially the record, but I think the record's probably held by Bill Russell or Wilt Chamberlain. You saw Mark Eaton set the all-time record, 5.6 blocks per game. 5.6 blocks per game because the way the game was played. It was a little bit more up-tempo in the 1980s than it is now. Well, considerably more up-tempo, actually. And not that many people took three-point shots. You still had much more quality big men in the league. You had more post players scoring. And you had players who challenged big men more so then. You didn't have these rules set in play where centers couldn't be in the paint. That's another factor. You get what I'm saying? And this is with established numbers that can't be refuted. Now, how could a guy like Chamberlain or Russell average 7, 8, 9 blocks a game? Harvey Pollack estimated, the great statistician, that Chamberlain had 2 seasons where he averaged over 10 blocks per game with the Philadelphia Sixers. Now, how could these numbers be possible? They seem cartoonish. Well, because in the 1960s, teams played at a frenetic pace. If you ever look at some of these old 1960s games, oftentimes these guys just took the first available shot. Okay? They took the first available shot. It wasn't all of this passing going around, which is also why, curiously, and this further proves my point here, this is curiously why in this fast neck pace basketball that was the 1960s, which produced all of these inflated but still great numbers. Elgin Baylor's 38.4 points per game or 3 points per game, 61-62 season. Oscar Robertson's triple-double. Wilt Chamberlain's 50-point scoring average. You know, you had guys like Jerry Lucas having 20 rebound seasons. You had Nate Thurman have a 20 rebound season, I believe, per game. When you had this breakneck, paradoxically, despite the fact that you had these inflated rebounding and block totals, blocks are just guesstimated, assists weren't really that high. You know, you would think, well, these guys should have been getting like 15, 16, 17 assists per game. What counts as assists today didn't count as assists back then. And oftentimes, like I said, the point guards often didn't get as many opportunities to set men up to get credited for assists. Because you had a lot of one-on-one scorers get the basketball and then taking the first available shot. The ball wasn't always in the point guard's hands at all times. But because the game was played at such a high pace, because of that, instead of a team having 90 shot attempts, they might have 130. I'm trying to explain it as basic as possible. 130 shot attempts as opposed to 90. So that's 30, 35, 40 more shot attempts at its peak. Some teams, right? Now you take that, and you also include the fact that there was no three-point line. Players were challenging Chamberlain and Russell. Because you understand, before these guys, there were no shot blockers of their stature. And many of these guys, I'm gonna yield to something a little bit. You didn't always have the greatest athletes in the league. I think you had great ball players, but some of these players weren't the most athletic. So sometimes with a guy like a Chamberlain and Russell, because of the lack of athleticism, the lack of sometimes creativity within the shot, a lot of those guys still had those set shot you know, those set shot jumpers, right? Or those shot attempts with the set shot, let's say that. Because a lot of times they didn't even really jump with those shots. You had a lot more blocking opportunities. Do you understand what I'm saying? Last but not least, before 1965, the lane was shorter. Instead of these 16-foot lanes, you had 12-foot lanes. So it was a center league. It wasn't the same game as it is now. So when you take all these things into account, yes, it's very probable that Russell and Chamberlain had seasons where they averaged 6, 7, 8, 9 blocks per game. Maybe even 10. It's not ridiculous. Because look at it like this. Vlade Divac once had a game where he blocked 12 shots a game. The NBA record since it's been counted was 17 blocks. Lynn Elmore, I believe it was. 17 blocks. Or was it Elmore Smith? I can't remember. But I know it's 17 blocks, the NBA record. Is it really hard to believe a guy like Wilt Chamberlain, a 7'1" behemoth with a tremendous vertical leap similar to a Michael Jordan or a Vince Carter, could get 20-something blocks in a game? Is it really that hard to believe? The way the game was played? And you say, like, well, how could he have so many more career blocks? Well, you have to, it accumulates over time. I'm trying to find a way to explain this. Let's say rebounds weren't kept. Let's say rebounds were only guesstimated and the league didn't keep track of rebounds when Wilt and Russell played. And let's say we had these researchers that would go and say, according to our estimates, Russell had over 20,000 career rebounds. Wilt nearly 24,000, possibly 25,000 rebounds. The first thing people would say, well, that's simply impossible. Abdul-Jabbar played 20 years and he only had 17,440. Moses Malone, my God, he was a great rebound. He only had 16,000. How is it possible? They would have to play 30 seasons to get that. They would have to play X amount of seasons. Jabbar had to play 27 seasons to get those numbers. Are you trying to tell me Chamberlain did that in 14 years, and Russell only did it in 13? That's cartoonish. You get what I'm saying? But the numbers prove that they got those rebounds. Perhaps inflated because Russell averaged 22.5, Chamberlain 22.9, as opposed to the great rebounders of this era and past eras averaging 11, 12, 13 rebounds per game. So why is it hard to believe that a guy like Russell and Chamberlain, instead of averaging 3 blocks a game for their careers, may have averaged 5 or 6 blocks per game? Average now. I strongly believe that Bill Russell probably averaged about 6 blocks per game in his career. Chamberlain might have averaged something around 7. Now that's believable. 9,000 may be a little bit too much, but I strongly, strongly believe that Bill Russell and Chamberlain got at least 6,000 to 7,000 career blocks, at the very least. But Russell himself said earlier in his career he was getting probably 6, 7, 8 blocks per game. That was just his guesstimate. So we'll never know the exact numbers. But I always laugh when the NBA says Hakeem Olajuwon is the all-time leading shot blocks leader. That's baloney. That's baloney because, like I said, I always think that the top shot block leaders are probably Chamberlain, then Russell. Nate Thurman probably number 3. because he was a very prolific shot blocker himself. Then Kareem, who probably had well over 4,000 career blocks. Then Hakeem Olajuwon. That's my top 5 list as far as unofficial. I don't care what the NBA says. I don't care what anybody says. I think it's Chamberlain, Russell, Nate Thurman, Abdul-Jabbar, and Hakeem Olajuwon.